Okay, so we have our project. Let's look at some ways to move the camera around in space. So let's start with a simple keyframing just to start with. So I have my camera. I'm in the perspective view. If I hold this down and start to move it, I can see down in the right-hand corner the camera's view, so I can pan the camera straight through here and get an idea. That's kind of a nice movement. So let's add that to our movie. So remember, in order to start this motion, what I like to do is put a keyframe in there manually first. So up here in the inspector window, I have the camera selected. I'm going to insert a position keyframe. Let's hit the record button. Okay, so I have my first keyframe set. I'm going to hit the record button. I'm going to move the playhead over and move the playhead to right there. Now I'm going to grab this handle and I'm going to drag my camera right through my objects. I'm going to untick the record button, and let's look at that in the perspective view first. Right through there. Good. Now let's look at it from the active camera view. It's kind of a nice movement. Okay, now might be a good time to examine the Keyframe Editor just a little bit more in depth. So let's look into the graphical Keyframe Editor. So I'm going to open up my timing pane. And remember, there are three tabs here. So we have our basic timeline. That tells us when our objects exist in three-dimensional, in the space of the time of the movie. And the second tab is our Keyframe Editor. Now, when I have the camera selected here, this gives me the keyframes associated with the camera. And right now, as we just saw, I just moved the camera down the z-axis straight through the other objects. So that's what it's showing us. We see this animated, this curved line here, and this is a graphical representation of that movement through space. And I can change this from here, so I can highlight these, delete them, and move them in time and space. So this just indicates the z-axis. Now this is a little tricky to kind of play with, but as you'll see when you start going through this, you'll be able to figure out what these lines represent in space. So here I just shortened this curve. Now when I move my playhead through, my camera doesn't move as far. So the depth, or the distance down on this graph, indicates the depth of the Z space. Okay, so I'm going to delete that keyframe just by right-clicking, hit delete. So now I don't have a keyframe associated with that. I get no movement. Alright, so that's a basic keyframe. And remember, that can be applied to rotation, twisting the camera on its side, sort of flying in and out. You can keyframe that by moving, adjusting, and adding keyframes. But there are some other ways to move the camera around as well. Let's look at some of those. And those will have to do with the Behaviors tab up here. So let's add some behaviors to this camera that we have selected. We're going to go into our library. And let's look at a couple of camera-specific behaviors first. So we have some interesting ones in here, and they're fun to play with. But mainly I'm going to focus on framing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this framing behavior. If you look up here in the description, it moves the camera to frame an object in the camera's view. So this is a good way to get the camera to move through your 3D space and stop on a specific object. So if I grab this, drop it on my camera, and then come into the inspector, you're going to see over here in our properties window we now have something under the behaviors tab, and we have a lot of options here. You can change how fast it starts and stops on its move. We can offset the path, we can orient it, but a good place to start is just to define a target. And right here on our object well, we can just take something and drop it into that space. So let's grab the rectangle since it's in the back. We're going to drop it into that hole. Now if you look over here, there's a frame. Now that's going to define where the camera moves to. So here's the frame of the camera's view. Here's the frame of the framing behavior. So when I take this rectangle and drop it in the well, that frame's going to change and go around that rectangle. So let's play through that and see what happens. Alright, so it centers that camera in front of the rectangle. Let's take a look at that inside our camera view. Notice it frames that rectangle perfectly in that. Now we can adjust how tightly it frames that. But that gives you some good options. Now, what this allows you to do is move an object. I'm going to grab this rectangle, let's slide it way over here, let's go back, and let's rotate it. So now I have this object way back in the distance. And it's not even viewable on my camera view. Oh yeah, it is slightly viewable. Now let's see what happens. That's going to slide all the way over and frame that view. So I can adjust that framing behavior just like any other object in my timeline. Now it happens a little faster. And faster. Let's make that happen a little faster. Let's add another framing behavior to follow that. So I'm going to put a second one on there. Framing 1. Let's make that come after on the timeline. Let's go to our inspector. Let's drop the circle on there. Now let's see what happens with that one. So we're going to go back, hit the triangle, going to pause, going to turn around, swing over, and hit the circle. Now this can get complicated fast, but it gives you a good idea of what's going on. And if we look at the top, we can actually see our path. So let's play through that and see how it looks. It's going to move to the pretty cool. So as you're contemplating moving this camera in and out, check these behaviors out over here under the library, behaviors, camera, and these behaviors. You can do things like zoom in and out, sweep, which allows you to turn the camera around an axis over time, focus, which is pretty cool. You can throw things in and out of focus. That's a really nice one. And you can simulate depth of field that way. But let's look at a way to draw ourselves a path. So I'm going to go up to the top view. Let's zoom out a little bit. Here we can see our rectangle in the back, our yellow rectangle in the middle, and our circle. So let's assume, let's move this camera around and then fly over here. But let's do this ourselves. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come up and select the Bezier tool, which is this little curve here. You notice my pointer changed to a pen nib. I'm going to come in and I'm going to select a point somewhere in front of where I want to start. Swing around to the side. Now I'm going to click and drag. I'm going to drag a little bit of a curve there. And you can swing this around and kind of see how that works. I'm going to come drag another point over here, and I'm going to adjust this curve by stretching it out and try to make this a nice smooth transition here. So I have a line. And what I like to do is I like to just hit outline here, and you can even bump the width up a little bit so you can see it. And here's our line. So now this exists right this second as an object in our composition. So let's use this rather than an object as a path. So I'm going to go up here to my library. I'm going to select behaviors. I'm going to select basic motion. Now we looked at some of these already, like spin and move. Let's look at motion paths. So I can apply this to an object, or I can apply it to the camera. I'm going to apply it to the camera in this case. Okay, so I have my camera and I have my motion path behavior. If we look in our inspector, under behaviors we have some selections here. We can draw a line in here, but I prefer to use the line I already drew. So I'm going to select geometry, and that gives me our familiar object well. So I can grab this line, I can drag it into that well. Now I also want to deselect it here so it's not visible. Now that is a path rather than a object. So let's play from start. Here's our camera moving along our path. Notice it stays in the same orientation. It's just following that central point. And that's fine. So now let's point our camera at an object. So we have our camera, it's moving, but it's not kind of pointing where we want. We can control that with another behavior, and that is point at. So I'm going to drag this on the camera. We'll look at our inspector again. Here's our familiar well, and I'm going to select rectangle, drop that in there. Now when I play this, it should change the focus. Notice it's aiming the camera now at the rectangle. All right, let's see how that looks through our active camera. Now the length of that motion path determines how quickly it moves along that path. So it moves completely along that path over this amount of time. So in order to change that, let's shorten our amount of time there. Now let's play through. It's going to move a little bit faster, and it's going to hang on that view. There it is. So mix and match your behaviors. There's basic motion, keyframing, or camera motion. And you should be able to achieve some interesting effects. Remember, arrange these behaviors, these keyframes in the timeline to achieve that look that you want. And also, when you're doing these projects, remember, you can do a portion of the project, export it as a video file, do another portion, export as a video file, and then move that into Final Cut in order to stitch those together and make your final project. Good luck.